Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the break. This next session is going to focus in on the category of economic incentives that are market entry rewards. Again, the concept is delinking the volume utilization of an antibiotic with the revenue that's generated upon marketing the drug. At this time, I'd like to invite all of the panelists for this next session to join me up here on the stage. So our opening presentation for this panel is by Kevin Outerson at Boston University and Executive Director of the new CarbX. Kevin will be covering issues related to market entry rewards, and then after Kevin speaks, we're going to stay aligned with the previous panel. I'll ask each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, where you're from, your perspective, and a couple comments on reaction to Kevin's presentation. This group also has a number of questions already on the table from the previous session, and so we will try to address all of those too. So now I'd like to turn things over to Kevin. Thank you.
All right. Good morning. If you're happy, if you're unhappy about the election results, I just advise you to stay off Facebook today. Okay. And if you're pleased with the election results, please also just stay off Facebook, no matter what. Market entry rewards. Well, as Gregory said, I'm with CarbX. I'm also work with Christine in Drive AB. My talk right now is my academic work, not representing either of those groups. Many of you would have seen this slide before. 3 things we need to do simultaneously in antibiotics. We have to deal with access, because more people are dying from lack of access to antibiotics globally than we have dying from resistant infection today. Sustainable use or stewardship, because if we can continue to just waste the drugs, we've done nothing. And certainly innovation, which is a big focus of what we're talking about today, but innovation without an access plan and innovation without stewardship is just wasteful. And so delinkage or market entry rewards, and I view those terms as synonymous, are a way to try to simultaneously solve all of these 3 things together. Picking 1 or 2 of these and trying to fix it without doing the third, I think is a mistake in this specific area. It's been a lot of work by many groups over the past few years. This is just some of them, of the groups that have looked at antibiotic delinkage pull mechanisms and have come to really, over time, a convergence of views. And I could actually add to this a couple more groups in the past 12 months who've also added their views. So we definitely need more both push and pull incentives. So Brad Spellberg in the previous talk saying we need more money for discovery. I agree. We also need more money for pull incentives as well. Delinkage, the idea that let's not pay based on the volume of sales for antibiotics, but pay based instead on the value, the social value, or something else, but not on the volume, because we don't want to give incentives to overmarket or to overuse the drugs. We have to also think about access to sustainable use, the other 2 pieces of the tripod. And whatever we do needs some level of global coordination or collaboration. All right? This is a slide similar to the one that Gregory had shown earlier about, but he had it horizontally, the different phases. This one is more vertical. So in the preclinical area, without a doubt, we need more money. And this can come through NIAID, but also CarbX is preclinical funding in this space. Significant progress has been made in this area in terms of funding. Certainly a lot more can be done globally. On the clinical trial side, BARDA and NIAID have been doing this funding for a number of years, and those programs are regarded as a lifeline for companies doing antibiotic clinical trials. In the post-registration space, what happens after FDA approval? If we're really successful in this pipeline, if we discover new molecules and fund them in preclinical and fund them in clinical, and then they reach the market and they still can't be sold because of totally appropriate stewardship. And if they are sold, they're sold for low prices which don't return any return on investment to the investors, then you don't have much. You've just stoked the pipeline and then killed them as they hit the market. right? And so the thought of delinkage is what do we do here? Okay, and delinkage and market entry reward, I say, are the same thing. Lord Jim O'Neill are really clever at coming up with names, and he renamed delinkage market entry reward, but we're going to treat them as the same. 5 things I want to talk about today. First, the structure. So I turned to an article that I co-authored with John Rex, who's here today, in Lancet Infectious Disease 2016. A lot of what we'll talk about in the structure we'll see from this article. Okay, has to be a guaranteed, unambiguous payment, right? We don't want something that the company 2 or 3 or 5 years out isn't sure whether the money is going to be there. And it's going to vary with the target product profile. I'll explain this in a later slide. In other words, not every antibiotic gets the same reward. This isn't like Wobegon. Not everyone is above average. Some antibiotics deserve a small reward, some deserve a larger one, some deserve something extraordinary. So it needs to vary based on the target product profile of the drug. As many have said, spreading it over a couple of years is helpful on many respects. We just chose 5 here as a way to think about it and to talk about it. The company should not be making profits from sales volume. So sometimes you'll hear people talk about, partial delinkage. That would just be saying that it's a mechanism which they make some profits based on sales volume. Full delinkage would just be they're not making any profits on sales volume. And there has to be some sort of conditions. On stewardship, you can't give somebody a $1 billion prize and then allow them to overmarket, mismarket, not be careful with the drug, not have it available to the people who need it globally. So some conditions. So those are the basic structure of a market entry reward. Let's talk about the magnitude. So in the article I wrote with John, we gave these 3 estimates. The CIRCAIA, which is the Eastern Research Group report. I was one of the co-authors in that report. Sharma and Taus from the Office of Health Economics, an industry-sponsored group in London. And the review of antimicrobial resistance, funded by the Wellcome Trust, reporting to the British Prime Minister, with different magnitudes, but all of them in the $1 billion and larger range. And so my suggestion, my approach here, even if you take the smallest one and then just roughly adjust it to 2017 dollars, then the base payment of what we're looking for in order to get an antibiotic to essentially break even, $100 million of net present value, not much of a huge reward, is $1 billion. Or if you spread it over 5 years, $200 million a year paid for 5 years after FDA registration. That's the magnitude of reward that I'm talking about. Okay. Adjustments to that number. How do you play with it? Also from, and I know this is too small, but it's one of the charts from our Lancet Infectious Disease article. And so just on the first column, the first row, if it's just a drug approved by the FDA and it meets basic standards, it's going to get the base payment. What I just said, the base payment would be $200 million a year for 5 years, a total of $1 billion. If it's a new mechanism of action, it gets something additional. If it's an oral drug, it gets something additional. If it's the second, third, or fourth in a new class, it gets something additional but smaller than the first. We put these out here not as the end of the discussion, but just to begin talking about what these adjustments should be in order to identify truly remarkable molecules which deserve maybe 2 or 3 times the base payment, and those that are more like Me Too's that might not deserve any base payment or just the base payment. Not in the article, not at least in this chart, but something that we've discussed in many fora around the world, is that we also have to think about beyond that 5 years. We've talked about drug shortages here today already. There may be a need for a much smaller but much longer payment just to keep the warm manufacturing base open on a drug and to keep the registrations in 160 or 200 countries around the world alive. That costs money. It's not hundreds of millions of dollars. It might be $20 or $30 million. But it costs money and it could be dealt with in this framework or in something that was ancillary to this framework, but deserves also to be thought about while we're doing this. So the adjustments are based on a target product profile, which is all the information in the previous slide. I think there should also be a clawback for federal funds, tax credits that have already been built in. And this was actually assumed in the $919 million figure from the Eastern Research Group, the Surkaya report, which was done for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In other words, imagine telling this story to Congress. Here's a molecule that the federal government has supported 50% or 80% of the cost of developing it, but they get the same prize, they get the same market entry reward as a molecule that had no support from the federal government. I think that's a difficult story to make. So the clawback would be a simple repayment. If you had received in clinical trials $20 million worth of help or $50 million from BARDA, you simply repaid it out of your $1 billion market entry reward or whatever the market entry reward happened to be. There must be global coordination. It doesn't have to be a global agency. There's lots of thoughts about how this can work in terms of the U.S. doing our share and European countries and other countries doing their share. For example, it would be good to agree on a common target product profile for everyone to be aiming for the same target. You know, Pfizer and Merck and Glaxo don't want different targets in the U.S. versus the EU on this regard. A couple of other rules that I think are important. I am a lawyer, so rules are important. I think this has to be guaranteed when the companies are pulling the trigger on R&D. So, you know, Brad mentioned earlier about being nimble and being able to change it. I agree with that. But whatever changes happen have to be prospective and not retrospective. You have to grandfather in people who made an R&D decision 5 or 7 years ago. So whatever changes are made do not affect research programs already underway. Okay. Companies will have some need to understand where they're going to fit as they're doing their phase 2, as they're beginning to plan their clinical trials and executing them. So there should be some way for them to meet with the agency, with the FDA or whoever is administering this process, and to get a clear signal of where they would fit on the target product profile if and when they're approved. So they have a way to calculate what the reward, market entry reward, will be for the company if they're successful. This was also addressed in the previous panel. I think it's my view that the payments cease if the drug is withdrawn. But obviously that's something that not everyone agrees with. But I think that's both politically expedient and also just necessary in this area. And generics raise an interesting question here. In most areas, having a generic is a social good. It lowers prices. It improves access. In this area, generics may actually trigger inappropriate use. There's all sorts of interesting questions. Generic entry is just different for antibiotics in terms of its social welfare calculations. We may need to think about special rules for generics. My last topic is funding. How do we fund this? Obviously, we could fund it through just federal money, and I think as was correctly pointed out in the previous panel, there's a concern with any sort of reward like this being dependent on annual congressional appropriation. At the very least, companies would severely discount that for political risk over time. The O'Neill report, and by footnote 2, I'm linking to the AMR review, suggested a pay-or-play sort of system in which the companies in the pharmaceutical industry that had antibiotic R&D programs would be fine, and the ones who didn't would have to have some sort of a levy or fee or tax that they pay to compensate for the fact that they were not contributing to the solution. User fees are a possibility. This is an article that Aidan Hollis from University of Calgary wrote up in the New England Journal in 2013. But some sort of a user fee structure that would be placed, maybe something on the order of a couple of dollars per prescription. Those funds could be used to fund it as well. And this fourth idea is really to marry this panel with the previous one, right? In my mind, transferable exclusivity vouchers, and certainly the way that I've approached this question since my April of 2016 article in Health Affairs on transferable exclusivity vouchers, is to think about this as a funding mechanism. This is a way to pay for market entry reward. So one way to think about this is that if a company has a market entry reward that's worth $2 billion based on their product profile, what they get is a transferable exclusivity voucher with a $2 billion cap on it. And they go off and either spend it themselves if they're a big company, or they sell it to somebody else if it's not something that they're able to use themselves. So I think these ideas can converge, and transferable exclusivity voucher can be the funding mechanism for market entry rewards. That's all that I have, and we have a great panel to discuss this in more depth.
Great, thanks, Kevin. So I think what we'll do is start with Jason and go down the line. Introduce yourself, your affiliation, and maybe some initial thoughts that you all have. But and after that, we have time for moderated discussion, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the folks in the room.
I'm Jason Brown from the Treasury Department, but like everyone else here, I'm not speaking on behalf of my institution. When I first was introduced, and I will say I'm not an expert on basically anything, but when I was first introduced to this topic and started to dig into the literature, I noticed the term market failure being used liberally from the perspective of an economist, and one of the the challenges when being told that everything that we don't like about the market for antibiotic development and use is a market failure is that you sort of tend to kind of throw up your hands and say, the market's so dysfunctional, we need to just sort of scrap it and start from scratch. But also, you kind of lose sight of the actual market failures as an economist would view them, and it does appear that there are some real market failures here. So, and I think that this market entry reward gets at one real market failure, and that to kind of be precise is that. There are people who will benefit from a new antibiotic who never take it, and that is the and therefore they'll never pay for the antibiotic, and that is, I guess, lost profit from the point of view of the pharmaceutical. What I think. What I think this market entry reward tries to do is it tries to address this problem, which is, that the market for antibiotics, will not promote the development of antibiotics, at all to some extent, or as quickly as it could be, if it factored in the value of the value to the people who are not infected, who would have been otherwise. So I think one of the challenges is to figure out, well, like, how do we value this this market entry reward? And as Kevin kind of points out, that if it's just a transferable exclusivity voucher, that's kind of a it's almost random, and it doesn't have a whole lot of relationship to the actual value to society of these foregone infections. And so it's really important that whatever the mechanism is for providing this incentive, that we try to be precise about what it is we're trying to reward and narrowly target what we think is the market failure, the real market failure. And so just to kind of be a little more specific about how I would think about what this what this market entry reward should do, or how it should be valued, is that the amount that we should give as a market entry reward should be the amount that it takes to make it worthwhile for a pharmaceutical to bring a drug to market, to the extent that society itself values it in those foregone infections. So if if we can pay pharmaceuticals, to bring something to market or to accelerate its introduction, up to some point where we as a society value that, then that seems like it's a reason for policy intervention. But I also think it's important that we not get caught up with in thinking about this market entry reward with every sort of other possible thing that we might think is a problem, like stewardship, or which itself is a problem. But to me, that requires kind of a different set of policy tools. I'll stop right there and let others jump in.
Great, thanks, Jason. Vikas?
Hi, I'm Vikas Goyal from SR1. A lot of people talked about investors on the discovery side, and that's where we are. We've invested in Sparrow, Macrolide, and Gladius Pharmaceuticals, and historically we've been investors in Alios and Protez and a number of other infectious disease companies. And so, I'm not convinced that the market doesn't work here, because if I was convinced of that, then I shouldn't have been investing my LP's money in these companies. GlaxoSmithKline would fire me if I kept doing that, right? And maybe they will someday, but right now they haven't done that. And I think there's a number of reasons that have nothing to do with economics that explain a very barren pipeline, in part that these are really scrappy bugs that are very hard to kill. And they're infecting very sick patients who are really hard to treat. And so when we throw some putative essential target into a high throughput screen and we get tons of hits and they don't work, that has nothing to do with market incentives. And so there is no amount of money that can guarantee us a safe and effective treatment for Acinetobacter. That is just an impossible amount of money to articulate, because we just don't know how easy or difficult it will be to do that. And so I live in a world of risk tolerance, and what I'm hearing today is a lot of risk intolerance. And that's just a very bad way to try to support innovation, because innovation involves, unfortunately, failure. And the way our industry, the early stage biotech venture capital industry, survives through that risk is through delinkage via M&A events. So historically, SR1 has made most of our financial returns as an investor when we've taken an early stage company through some early clinical proof of concept, and they have been acquired by a larger company who is then able to take on the commercial and clinical and regulatory risks to take it further down the path. And so Alios was acquired by J&J based on early phase 2 data and pediatric RSV for $1.75 billion. That really made a difference to us, because we couldn't run a pediatric RSV trial. There's just no way early stage venture capital's investors could support that kind of program. I am also not sure that we would have been able to build a company that knew how to do that. But I think J&J can bring a lot of resources in addition to the Alios team to really make that happen. And frankly, like $1.75 billion, that's a lot more attractive than like the $350 million that the priority review vouchers were getting, right? I mean, 350 is not bad money, but it's less than 1.75. So, I think where we sort of see the challenges is more around the disconnect between the unmet need for treatments for Acinetobacter and the ability to predict how prevalent those infections might become in the developed world. And if we can delink those events, because I think stewardship we can predict for, right? We can assume that stewardship will be a hurdle for us for new therapies. Relatively low pricing or perceived low pricing relative to like oncology drugs, that's not a risk per se, that's just reality. So these things we can build into our investment thesis, but it's very hard to predict how frequent an Acinetobacter infection might become in the US, and it's very hard to figure out how I'd run that kind of phase 2 trial. And so now I step back and say, would I invest in a Acinetobacter only program? I probably wouldn't, because I can't figure out what to do with it. but I understand that there's an unmet need there, right? So if there was a reward that said, okay, if you've hit Acinetobacter, so as we think about the guidelines, I wonder if you should specifically target those things which are terrible market opportunities right now, right? And it means a very, very narrow set of opportunities that are eligible for these rewards, which frankly means it may not really affect investor behavior at the very early stages, because those will be narrow sets of opportunities where the rate limiting factor will still be the availability of innovation that's worth exploring and taking further into experimental development.
Okay, thank you. Next, Manos.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to participate. Manos Peros, I work for a small biotech that works on gram-negative antibiotics. A few words, first of all, about where I'm coming from. I'm a discovery guy. I'm a chemist. I've worked in big pharma, actually 3 big pharma companies, 2 of which have since stopped antibacterial research. Go figure whether it's a coincidence or not. And I work in a small company. So a few things that I believe about antibacterial R&D. So first of all, having worked in big and small companies now, I think both are needed. And to Brad's point about if we had a couple of billion to invest in antibacterial research, putting it in big pharma might not be the best place, where $2 billion might not be enough. If you look at how much it actually costs to develop those 800 and some drugs that are in the oncology pipeline from big pharma and small companies, it's several times that amount. And really, in aggregate, even today, big pharma spends more than that couple of billion in this field every year. So I think we need, one of the premises I have is we need some of that private investment from big pharma, from venture capital groups, small companies, and in academia to have that healthy ecosystem that will grow that pipeline. To go from 37 to 800, it won't happen with $2 billion. The second premise is I have some bad news for you, Brad. It doesn't take 13 years to get from a new project to a drug. It might take 13 years for a successful program to achieve that, but to start a successful program, you need to build a team or rebuild a team. You need to train. You need to develop the know-how or redevelop the know-how, and that will take longer. And so any incentives we think about need to survive the 4-year administration cycle, actually. Maybe it's even shorter than 4 years. But administrations change, and even if year-to-year appropriations is not a solution, a 4-year or 5-year plan might not be a solution either. The third premise is incentive will drive behavior, and equal incentives will drive similar behavior. If we treat antibacterials as a non-for-profit field, we will get a non-for-profit pipeline. If you think 37 drugs are not enough in the pipeline for antibiotics, take a look at the pipeline for malaria or tuberculosis. Sure, it's better than a decade ago. It's nowhere near 800. So we won't get from 37 to 800 on the back of non-profit incentives. That's my belief. This said, we do have an urgent case on our hands. And for those of you with medical background, you'll forgive me the analogy, but when we admit a patient with an acute myocardial infarction, I can't believe I pronounced it, you may be unconscious, they're dying, you don't start discussing with them lifestyle changes, diet, and perhaps a statin. You try to you take them to the cath lab, you try to take care of that. I think for the previous panel and for this panel, we're talking about the cath lab. I think we're talking about incentives that will benefit short term and sure will benefit small companies more than big companies. And we need to do that, but let's think about doing it in a way that will not close down what I think is the truly only sustainable way to engage a business in a behavior. And that, unfortunately, is profit. CEOs change like administrations change, and Pfizer's CEO who discussed the exclusivity voucher with Bob Gaidos was 2 CEOs ago. How do you get Pfizer to stick to their word? You can't. You can't. The only way you will get them to stick to their word is that they should see a profit in investing in antibacterials. And Jason, I agree with you with everything you said, except I would add that we should not be thinking about giving pharma enough money to make it worthwhile for pharma to bring an antibacterial to market. We need to give pharma enough money for them to make it worthwhile to divest from one area and bring in antibacterials because their resources are finite. And so making some profit or breaking even is not enough. A business will make as much profit as it can. I would like to venture that most of us have stock in pharma through our pension plans and others, and you would want to know that if you give $1, it will return the best dollar possible. So let's think about it in that way. It's relative to other things. Let me get to the incentive that Kevin you put on the table, and I commend you for putting a number because I think a number is much needed. And despite everything I said, there is a place for it. We need to think about it. So let me tell you why I think this might be an accurate number, but maybe not the right number. I think it's an accurate number because folks who are much smarter with numbers than I am have done the bottom-up calculation, the NPV, probably close to what it costs to get a successful drug to the market, $1 billion or thereabout. Looking at it from the other perspective, from the market perspective, you look at small companies that got to the market with a single product, got approval, then got acquired. The price of that acquisition is close to that. Is that 600 million to 800 million, you risk adjust for the 5 years and discount, you end up to that $1 billion reward. So not a bad number. But in the same way that those numbers are not driving the behavior that we all want to see, more discovery, more development, given another number of equal value, I would put to you is unlikely to change things for the better. So let's think of what the right number would be, but also let's do it in a way, let's build the incentive in a way that will not close down the opportunity for profit, because I think the market does and will reward truly differentiated drugs. The reason we have 800 in oncology and not 37 is because companies see the opportunity to profit. So let's not do something that we'll have to pay for in the future.
Great, thank you. John?
Great comments, Manos and Vikas, in particular. This theme about benefiting big companies.
John, you want to? I think everybody, most know you, but do you want to introduce?
I will do that in a second. I was going to say before I want to say that's interesting to hear about the idea of benefiting small companies by benefiting big companies. I'd never heard that articulated in quite that way. It's sort of interesting. So I'm John Rex. I'm a board-certified internist and infectious diseases specialist. And it is useful to know where people come from. I spent 15 years as a physician at an academic medical center doing patient care. I've spent 15 years developing drugs in large pharma. I've spent 4 years developing drugs in small pharma VC-backed settings. And across that collection of experience, some of which overlaps, I have taken drugs through every phase of development. I have run one each of every kind of phase 3 antibacterial trial that there is and run them successfully. I've also been involved with other classes of drugs, antifungal drugs in particular. At this point, what I do is I'm the CMO of a small venture-backed antifungal company. I am the chief scientific officer for the CARB-X initiative, more about that in a second. And I closely advise Wellcome Trust on its drug-resistant infection strategy, and I variously consult with different companies in the industry. So my comments come out of that body of experience, and I want to make comments in, I think, about 4 different areas. The first comment has to do with the idea of more money for discovery, and I fully endorse that. The one add I have to that is that any company doing work in this area has to have skin in the game. You can't be doing it 100% with public money, because there's this danger of companies that are sometimes called zombies, companies that just refuse to die, and it's a dead drug. It really is. It's a dead drug, and it shouldn't be pushed anymore. But for some reason, there's money available to cause the wheels to turn a little bit. But when you tie it to Vikas's money, then people are willing to say, no, it's enough, this is dead. So CARB-X, as one of its part of its funding strategy. So for those of you who don't know about CARB-X, it is a approximately $350 million public-private partnership that will be dispensing that $350 million over the next 5 years in a non-equity, non-dilutive fashion to preclinical companies. The money principally comes from the U.S. government, courtesy BARDA. There's also some money that's coming from the Wellcome Trust in the UK and another group in the UK called the AMRC. There are a number of requirements to get a grant from CARB-X, but one of them is you have to have some of your own money. You actually have to have money in the bank. You have to look like a company. You have to have an address. You have to be able to look like you could go for 12 months. And that means you've actually convinced somebody else to give you money. So skin in the game is really important. Second comment is about which drugs need to be developed. It's really easy to be seduced by the illusion of skill with respect to picking out what you think is important and what's going to go forward. And there are many stories about drugs that for a long time didn't seem to be valuable, and then all of a sudden they were very valuable because suddenly we discovered another use for them. You can't do something with a drug unless it actually exists. And when Kevin and I were thinking about that paper about how to prioritize TPPs and say which drugs are more or less valuable, we really wanted to come up with things that were unambiguous and durable. And the idea that, well, today I want gram negatives, and I wanted gram positives 10 years ago, but now I don't want any more of those. Now I want gram negatives. That could flip-flop again in 10 years. It's really, I think it's tricky to write this down. At the end of the day, they're really only gram negatives and gram positives, and you can put them in a few buckets. And really what we're saying that we'd like to have is novelty. And that's the one thing that I can in general identify. You can argue for a long time about precisely how to write. It's surprisingly hard actually to define novelty. But I think we could probably get at some general rules for that. And that for me is a key thing. It is that I really would like to see most money going into things that are of a new molecular class, because if nothing else, they are new. And I think Brad said it. If it's a new scaffold, you may be able to riff off that for a long time. And so finding one of those is enormously valuable. It's also not helpful to set it based on apparent rate of the organism. So take an organism called Acinetobacter, which is a not terribly common organism. You might say, oh, maybe we don't have to develop new drugs for that. But I will tell you that once upon a time when I was a practicing doc, I closed a surgical ICU for 2 weeks because of an outbreak of Acinetobacter infection. I want you to think about that. I shut down the ICU, which meant that I shut down ORs. There were people who needed elective surgery who didn't get their surgery. The knock-on cost to the hospital, to the docs, I have no idea what it was. Not to mention the people that got sick and the ones that died in the process of this little outbreak of Acinetobacter. So it's important to think about antibiotics as being the equivalent of somewhere in this room there's a fire extinguisher. Somewhere, I can't see it right now, but I guarantee you there's one. What's the correct number of building fires per year at this hotel? 0. Yet we have a fire extinguisher on the wall, and we would not come in here without a fire extinguisher. When should we pay the firemen who are down the street? About a couple blocks away, there's a fire station. When should we pay them? Is it per fire? No. So I really want to emphasize this notion that frequency of a problem doesn't equate to the importance of a problem, because there can be events that shut you down. How much did we spend on Ebola in the United States? How many cases of Ebola were there in the United States? Probably count them on the fingers of 2 hands. We spent billions of dollars. It's enormous for lack of a fire extinguisher. So lack of a good antibiotic can get you in trouble there. And so we've already commented on this. So that's my comment on setting priorities. They've got to be stable. A drug that gets tagged as having been valuable shouldn't lose that. And you really have to avoid the illusion of skill, and I'm all about diversity. Briefly, I want to comment on the need to spread out spending. Spread out the rewards, spread out the income. We often speak of drugs as if you develop it and you get it approved. Please understand that the initial approval, particularly with the new regulatory pathways, is only step one in there's another 10 years worth of work to do. You will not yet at that, you may not yet at that point have all the formulations you need. Your pediatric work won't be done. There may be unusual settings that can now be explored. Having now shown to myself in a skin study that I know how to dose it and I understand its side effects, maybe now I go and do an osteomyelitis study. Very valuable work to do. So there's another 10 years worth of work to do, and you want to incentivize that. So if you look at the table that Kevin and I wrote, there's stuff buried in there like getting another indication approved is worth some money. So you've actually you're incentivized to do the additional work. Really important that you set that up. You also want to be attentive to the supply chain. We don't think about this much. Where did the drug on the shelf in the pharmacy come from? Well, it came from some plant somewhere. And if it's a sterile injectable, I have to tell you that most of the drugs we're developing are things that are meant to be put in your veins. Sterile injectables are such a pain you can't imagine. About once a year, the lyophilizer that's processing your materials is going to blow up and you're going to lose 50,000 vials. And if you only have one supply chain, the supply chains tend to be these long, delicate, fragile things. You make one part of it here, another part of it someplace else, finally gets put into plastic bags. A break along that chain can mean suddenly you're out of stock on a drug. And that's a disaster as well. So having the incentive to maintain that very boring sounding thing called a supply chain is really, really important. And then my last comment is about the question of clawbacks. And Kevin and I have been debating this one a lot. I think it's tricky to know how much money went into a drug before it gets into about phase 1. It would be my thesis. Before phase 1, lots of stuff is sort of mix and match. You might be working on multiple scaffolds at the same time. How do you account for that? I have no clue. But once a drug is in phase 1, I then do begin to be able to count more or less how much I've spent on it. So, one last comment about the question of access. Somehow all these mechanisms need to avoid the perception that the drug is free to the user. Really important. And I don't have a general purpose solution to that. I mean, do you give it a price, and then when it gets sold, the profit on that sale goes to fund someplace else? I mean, there might be some other ways to come up with this. But if you're going to get your money from a fully delinked block of money from someplace else, we should not let these drugs look like they are free. Otherwise, they will become the drug of choice, and we will lose it. So those are my thoughts.
Great. Thanks to all of you for these great comments. I guess, a couple of things seem to have come up on this session and the previous session, and they're really related. So, around how much does it take? Brad brought up on the earlier session a really good question of what are we incentivizing? And that did come up a little bit here as well. Kevin put out some numbers that others had also sort of aligned with, and it seems like the panel is at least saying that that's in the ballpark of what needs to happen, but the point of that, that $1 billion, that might be enough to encourage a merger and acquisition or to keep the process that Vika, as you said, that kind of works. The smaller companies do innovative things and then get bought out, and the amount of that is roughly the $1 billion that would be in the prize. Is that a good system that we want to encourage more of? Manos, you brought up that, well, maybe that's even still too low of a bar, because for big companies, it's not just a decision to go into this space, it's a decision to then devote resources to that space and maybe take from another therapeutic area or drug development programs and divest there to go into the space. So this, I guess, instead of focusing on the number, maybe the question of the group is the market entry reward the right mechanism to use to incentivize what we want to incentivize? So I think that question kind of keeps creeping into this session and the last one, and maybe I'd like to get a little more clarity or additional thoughts from you all on. So anybody want to jump on?
I'll start. So, actually one comment on the number. So what we like is $1 billion at phase 2, not on approval. That's a very different number. And if you want to reward innovation, rewarding innovation should be done in early clinical proof of concept, because a 0.5% incidence of liver failure is not related to innovation. That's related to safety and efficacy and tolerability. Innovation is about, did I achieve some signal of activity against the organism I care about, in the organ I care about? And that's not phase 3 or NDA. I mean, that's not, Sempra's way past that, right? That's not the issue for Sempra.
John?
So I'll argue that a market entry reward is a really important tool to use here. And we may need to use other tools, but it's the words market entry that are so critical to me. You know, if you want something done, reward the thing you want, which is, in this case, I want a drug that's registered. And it's you know, it's okay to provide some incremental stuff along the way, but you know, in large pharma historically, there have been, you know, I observed a pattern of groups having an annual target of putting a certain number of drugs into a certain number of chemicals into phase 1 each year, and you had to have them in by 31st of December each year, which would mean that sometime in December there would be a little rush of drugs that went into first-time in man studies, and then those drugs might then topple over in February. I mean, that's sort of it's an understandable pattern. If you incentivize starting in phase 1, people will do that. What we want is stuff to make it to the market, and getting to the market is hard. It is a lot of work. So I think this idea of incentivizing crossing that goal line is really important. And I'm not so bothered now that I think about it, though I guess it's good to bring it up and to talk about whether it could bother you or not. The idea that you're incentivizing the large company that bought the small company. I don't see that that's a problem, because you're getting what you want at the end of the day, and it means that the early VC funds who are, they're only willing to fund up to a certain size, and they need to turn over in a certain way. We're making the system work. So I mean, I'm really for it.
If I can build on that, I think Vikas and John, you're both right. I think that incentive is worth having. We need to acknowledge what exactly it incentivizes. I don't think it's there to incentivize innovation. It won't. It's just simply too far out when it gets to the market, too far from where innovation actually occurs. And it is there to do what John is describing, which is to get us more drugs urgently, because we need more drugs now. So what it will achieve, I think, is you will have companies that have assets in phase 1, perhaps in phase 2 that are perhaps repurposed or redeveloped or reformulated, and it will make it possible for them to take to the market and perhaps be acquired for the kind of value that gram-positive companies have reached in the last 5 years. And it was unfortunately not $1 billion in phase 2, but it was $1 billion in phase 3. So it will sustain that ecosystem. What it would not achieve is incentivizing innovation. And again, to my point, I think that's a longer-term job. That's one that we need to look at incentivizing with longer-term incentives, and quite frankly, sustainable incentives, which I don't know if cath lab, going back to my analogy, is a sustainable way of getting 800 drugs into the pipeline. It may get you from 37 to 50, but the drugs won't materialize in phase 1 and phase 2 in the next 5 years. They just won't.
Quick follow-up, John?
Well, I just want to ask Manas a question. So you're the chemist here in the group. How would you define innovation in this space in a way that's unambiguous at the point that you bring a compound forward to be assessed?
You won't like my answer. It's not a chemist's answer. I would let the market show you that. So innovation is a drug which, and I will take an example from Novartis, which is not a drug that I worked on, is Gleevec. It's a game changer. It's a step change from anything that was out there in oncology. Innovation is the first immuno-oncology drug that adds months and years to patients who were on their deathbeds. And you know it when you see it, but I can't really define it in a way that would allow you to say, here's $1 billion for your innovation. I'm looking at what happened in oncology, and why are we saying that we have a market failure in antibiotics? I think that we have a market failure not because it's a short course, not because we have lots of generics. I think we have a market failure because we do not have those fundamentally innovative drugs that are so much better than the drugs before that prescribers and patients, quite frankly, don't have any issue with paying extra money because those drugs do something that Other drugs did not. So that's my view on innovation.
Okay, Kevin, I think you had a thought?
So I would strongly prefer the market as opposed to a market, any sort of market entry reward. It would be nice if the market worked in this area. I think that the work by IDSA and everyone else on one of my slides, going back a decade now, illustrates that the market is not working. Maybe it's due to stewardship. I mean, name another drug product in which the government is actively working for very good reasons to cut your sales in half every year. Maybe it's diagnostic uncertainty that the doctor at the point of care can't tell whether you need your wonderful $10,000 per course of treatment drug or if the $100 generic is appropriate. And maybe it's the fact that Manos was just talking about, that these drugs are coming to market that are not highly differentiated. And they look similar. It's hard to tell the difference between them. And so it's hard to justify a premium price. We've had a whole meeting that has gone on for days on how difficult it would be to design a better clinical trial. It's beyond the scope of today's meeting. So I wish that the market worked in this area. And this is clearly a second best attempt to replicate what the market should, but for complex reasons is not doing. Second thing I want to say is that the $1 billion figure that I threw out there is the base amount. If you had a spectacular first-in-class drug that checked a lot of the boxes that were on that chart, you might be getting $3 billion, not $1 billion, okay? And the second thing to remember is that this is the U.S. response, not the global response. So that number should be larger if the European Union and other OECD countries chip in as well.
Okay, thank you. I've got one more question for the group, and then I'm going to turn it out to the room to see if you all have any questions. But this one's about stewardship. To think about the linkage, as we've at Duke Margolis, when we first started thinking about this to take on as a project, one of the emphasis was, well, you really, at least think you need to delink revenue from volume, because a company would be in a position, or is currently now in a position, that when the drug is on the market, they really need to push utilization in order to get a return. That's what we're trying to avoid, because that flies in the face of stewardship. So stewardship is important. The linkage theoretically enables more support from the company on stewardship. Some of the proposals even tie those, if you have instead of the lump sum, but you have staggered payments over 5 years, somehow tie that to availability of the drug and support for stewardship. But what does that really look like from a company's perspective? Jason brought up the point of, well, maybe that stewardship really shouldn't be tied to this, because that's a different issue. But I'd like to ask maybe a few of you on the panel, how do you see stewardship being linked, if it should be, to this market entry reward? What can a company actually do for stewardship? So thoughts? John? Okay, Manos?
Thank you. I absolutely believe that the two need to go hand in hand. We at the very least need to bear in mind the stewardship question when we think of incentives. I also think that there are several ways to ensure stewardship, and volume should not be an issue, because there are diseases that have far fewer patients in the US, and that pharma are investing because they are profitable markets to invest in. So I don't think the two are incompatible.
Any other comments?
Just to echo my comment that the drug shouldn't appear to the user to be free, but the cost when you actually need it shouldn't be punitive. And I think it's a tricky balance, and it means that the cost the apparent cost will be different in different countries, and that's okay too, and we sort of have to work with that.
Vikas?
Yeah, so again, from my perspective, I'll compare it to an M&A event, except with a structured buyout clause, where there are post-deal requirements. And in the biotech venture industry experience, typically the innovator receives about a third of those structured payments. That's the average and the median, actually, across many deals. And that's a significant discount. So when I hear about requirements to earn my reward, I have to fulfill requirements around proper utilization of my drug, then I assume I will not get the reward because I don't know how, as a small company, that I will do that.
Okay, Kevin?
So just say from my perspective, if the market entry reward was just there to do no damage to stewardship, then we're successful. And to give a contrary example, if you had a drug for an inborn condition in which you could molecularly or genetically diagnose the condition, and you sell that drug for $200,000, the market works for that because we're able to identify that person. We're not worried about overuse of that drug. If we had a $100,000 per course of treatment antibiotic, I think many in the room would fear for the company incentives to overmarket that to other related infections. And so that's the thought behind, not that we would put massive conditions on running global stewardship, but that the company, by the very nature of a market entry reward, no longer has an incentive to oversell. And once you've done that, the company's obligations are pretty much done, in my view. So I hope that makes you feel better.
And just one other thing to add about stewardship is that it's not just the drug that's involved. One of the reasons that antibiotics get overused is because, quite frankly, it's easy. You don't have to start a couple of drugs and you sleep well, right? You don't have to, rather than spend money or time on worrying about diagnostic testing. So what we need to do is we need to take a system-level view to the cost of using the antibiotic, and that means setting it up so, as is being done in the United States, the fact that having a stewardship program is about to be a condition of participation in Medicare, which means that if you're a healthcare institution, you won't get paid if you don't actually have an active stewardship program once this is in place, and that's going to cause people to say, I guess I need to spend the money to do that and do it right because I actually want to get this other stuff. So and that's not a drug-specific thing, but it's about sort of rolling up the overall cost of using an antibiotic into the whole care package.
Okay. We do have a few minutes left for this panel, so I'd like to open it up to the room for anybody who has questions over there. So each table has the microphone. Announce yourself and then your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating discussion. My name is Kira Kennedy. I'm from Amplex Pharmaceuticals. So the title of today's conference is about incentives for antimicrobials, which is more than just antibacterials. The O'Neill report, the United Nations Declaration, all specifically mention antifungals, which is an area of interest of mine. And I'm curious to hear what the panel thinks about how to not let antifungals fall behind in the conversation. So BARDA, CARB-X, everything's focused on antibacterials, and would love to hear your thoughts.
Thoughts I'm sorry? John?
Well, speaking as a dyed-in-the-wool mycologist, that's where I started my medical career, and I love to work on antifungals. Strategy is about making choices, and here what's happened is the decision to say the thing that's burning the biggest hole in our pocket is antibacterial resistance. And in part, it's an issue because bacteria have the ability to talk to each other. If bacterium X figures out how to become resistant, it can teach it to bacterium Y. Fungi don't have that ability. There absolutely are unmet needs in antifungals. There are a few companies working in that area. It's probably not enough. But, if you don't pick, you try to do everything, you get nothing done. And I think that's, so I'm just glad to be doing this much, to be honest with you.
And then, so CARB-X specifically, I think you've been clear that it's not just antibiotics, but other...
We can't cover antifungals.
You can't, okay.
So CARB-X is anything antibacterial. It doesn't have to be a treatment. It could be a preventive, it could be a diagnostic. As long as what it does can in some fashion be said to reduce or address the issue of antibacterial resistance, it's in.
Brad.
Yeah, so Brad Spellberg, LA County, USC. So, two comments that sort of reflect upon your comments, Manos, which are, as always, very wise. Sorry. reflecting on a couple of comments that Manos made, which are always very wise. He's a very wise man. In fact, this whole panel is very wise. The wisdom, the scale of wisdom here, because I'm going to reflect on you as well, Kevin. I'm worried now. Yeah. So the first, I just wanted to point out that one of the things that a nonprofit could do is partner with for-profit companies. And so the idea would not be that you eliminate, I don't think anybody wants to eliminate for-profit completely, but if you had a stable platform for discovery that wasn't susceptible to CEOs changing every 3 years, that discovery platform can then partner at later stages and do licensing and out-licensing deals with for-profits. So that's comment one. The more controversial comment, my thinking in this space has really evolved over the last 5 or 6 years. And it's in some ways evolved a lot more in line with what Kevin has been saying to me for a long time, and I never wanted to listen, which is that probably quantity is not the right measure. I actually don't want 800 drugs in the pipeline. There was a round table in 1965 led by 3 Nobel laureates and a bunch of other really famous people in ID. And their conclusion was that resistance is catching up so quickly to everything we bring to market that it's probably a really bad idea to bring a lot of drugs to market quickly. And it probably would make a lot more sense to bring 1 or 2 drugs every couple of years as long as those drugs we need. I don't want a huge pipeline because we're just going to blow through those drugs. What's the quote from, I can't remember who said it. Bringing a new antibiotic to market is sort of like giving a finer brand of brandy to an alcoholic. I'd like to have the drugs we need come out at a slow and steady and sustainable pace, not to incentivize a bunch of drugs to come out that we're going to abuse and then lose right away.
Any reaction or comments from the panel? No?
That was a very wise comment.
Okay.
I'll say something that we've kind of danced around a little bit, and that's the profit motive. And this is where I worry that we're going to, we try to throw the baby out with the bathwater and trying to incentivize antimicrobial development. I mean, I think we've heard, some examples throughout the morning of, the profit motive can actually work pretty well. And, because you were suggesting, Vikas and Manos both talking about, that if you can charge an appropriate price, a market clearing price for your drug and people pay for it, and that's sort of a good thing. And so, I worry that if especially in the context with the market entry reward, if we really try to tamp down on the profit that a pharmaceutical can make from its actual business, then that kind of raises what we need for the market entry reward to get the outcome that we want. But then we also have to throw in additional problems of unintended consequences. So, for instance, if a drug is, as sort of John sort of worries about, if it's too cheap, then you're going to have more stewardship problems, and then you have to kind of confront that. So that's why I say, we want to be very specific about the problem that we're trying to solve, and not oversolve the problems or not create more problems with what we're doing.
Okay. Other questions, comments from the group? Yes, please.
Thank you. Christine Ordahl from Norwegian Institute of Public Health. I was just curious about, I believe it's Manos, I was curious to hear about market entry reward. And do you think that this would incentivize SMEs to bring new products all the way to the market, all the way through? Or do you think that this would have a greater incentivization for large pharma to buy out smaller companies?
So, first of all, remember I'm a chemist. So that's okay. I know. I learned to live with that. I think for a small company to take something to market on its own costs. Once you risk adjust and discount the billion. To build a sales force, depending on the kind of drug that you want to launch, it actually takes more money than that. And I didn't want to go into what is the right number, but I think even with $1 billion or more, in today's marketing models, it'll be hard for a small company to do that. My view, I'd like to hear Vikas's view on that, is that it will put some value, some objective value on the company, which might make it a more attractive acquisition target. But again, the point I was making earlier, that's the price that Big Pharma would pay today for a company that has an antibiotic about to launch. So I don't know that it would be a huge incentive even for that. Now, if it was $1 billion at phase 2, that's different math. But $1 billion at launch, I don't know that it will make a huge difference. That's my worry.
I mean, anything that makes the path easier is very valuable, right? I think the successful companies in the SR1 portfolio, based on our financial return, they had multiple paths that they could pursue. They didn't have to be acquired. They didn't have to do it themselves. And if the incentive enables one or both of those paths, it will create an incentive for investors to pursue the space.
So there are people on Twitter today who aren't tweeting about the election. We have one question from the Twitter community directed to the panelists, and it's around what do you all think about incentives for rapid diagnostics? And I know that's a big issue that we're not necessarily tackling today, but you all might have some thoughts about the market entry reward for rapid diagnostics. Could that potentially be useful there as well? John or Kevin?
I'll just say, what Jason said about targeting things that have problems, that have the same market failures. We should think long and hard about this. I think that the problems and the difficulties, the struggles in the diagnostic market are really quite different. We do not have the same externalities. We don't worry about overutilization. And so I would be cautious. And if there's a case to be made for diagnostics for some sort of incentive, that should be made. But it seems to me it's a different case than for antibiotics.
I was just going to say that I think diagnostics are actually almost harder than this. Diagnostic tests are almost completely overlapping in what they do. It's hard to invent a new one that isn't basically functionally the same as the old one. So it's a question of accuracy and why should I use the test and would it actually make a difference in the drug that I'm going to choose to use right now, sort of a question. And those are questions that are in many ways larger than the diagnostic itself.
Can I add a perspective here? We work on antibiotics that we aspire to develop against specific pathogens so that you don't overuse them, you don't use them widely. It's a case of stewardship and preservation as well. For that kind of approach, diagnostics would obviously be a huge enabler. I'm new to the field, relatively new. I've only been working at antibacterials for the last 5 years. But looking at it from inside, from the outside in, this is a chicken and egg situation. For decades, people have been talking about targeted antibiotics coupled with diagnostics, but you need a diagnostic to develop the drug, and you need the drug for the diagnostic to sell. So I agree with you, Kevin, that it's a different beast, and I agree with you, John, that it's hard, but I definitely think it's worthy of investment if we're able to develop drugs that are not going to be used for a patient that has a garden variety pneumonia, as well as for the patient who has a multi-drug resistant Acinetobacter infection.
Yeah, and it's certain that the incentives for rapid diagnostics. I mean, so getting rapid diagnostics to market are a particular challenge. Also, technical challenge. There are reimbursement payment challenges. It's actually a topic that we'll be taking up over the next year at Duke Margolis. It's almost like in some respects, that one of the problems is the opposite. We want rapid diagnostics to be used all the time, as much as we can, so that we can really find out quickly what infections patients have. Whereas the antibiotics we're trying to incentivize, we don't want used all the time. And so the need for delinking from volume may not be as big for as for rapid diagnostics. We are running out of time. There was another question on Twitter, not necessarily related to this panel, more around the, I think around now I'm trying to bring it up, push incentives around whether or not the Longitude Prize, NIH Challenge, those kinds of things, are those substantial enough? Maybe to frame it in terms of this panel, as we've all been saying, the need for a pool incentive should be in combination with some of these push incentives. So any just comments on those kinds of prizes?
So I'm on the Prize Advisory Council for Longitude. And it's a 10 million pound prize for rapid point-of-care diagnostic that changes clinical practice. And we are halfway through the process, and we don't have a winner yet. And I think it's fair to characterize that, that perhaps the feeling is that the size of the prize is too small, compared to what companies really would want to see. That's my personal view.
Okay, Brad, you have the final word.
Sorry, I completely agree with that, Kevin. And it's also really not a push prize. It's a pull prize, and that's why it needs to be bigger. But the other interesting difference between a diagnostic and an antibiotic is the clinicians all want the diagnostic really badly. It's the hospital that doesn't want the diagnostic because of the way the hospital is paid by Medicare. That's where the incentive needs to be. It's to the pathology laboratory director who needs to break the silo and accept that his budget or her budget's going to go up so the pharmacy's budget can go down and the infection control budget can go down. That's where the leverage is.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for great presentations, all of you for questions, and certainly our few but dedicated Twitter followers today. We're going to go ahead and break for lunch right now, which is right over there. We'll give you 45 minutes, so we'll start back up for our final session of the day at 1:15 p.m. Thank you.